I'm Brent Friedman. Have you ever wondered if there's a secret connection between Hollywood and UFOs?
I'm Bryce Zabel. You're listening to Sound, Light, and Frequency.
Today we're going to venture off the beaten path and wade headlong into the phenomenon.
It's called woo. Researchers often don't like to talk about it, but we do. Brent, I didn't actually see the Friday document, video, photo dump coming from the Trump disclosure movement or whatever. I didn't see that coming until it was almost upon me. How about yourself?
I'm actually more intrigued by two specific reactions. One was from one of our Congress people who said, yeah, this initial stuff is not that exciting, but there's some big holy crap revelations that are coming down the pipeline. And I'm thinking, what a strange thing to say. Yeah, forget about the stuff that you're getting on Friday. There's other stuff down the road. What is he talking about? And why would he put it in that context? That's number one. Number two, if you remember earlier in the week before the dump, there was this story about, again, some Congress people giving a private briefing to a bunch of pastors, getting them ready for the revelations that were coming down the pike. And it provoked a bunch of content on the internet about pastors coming out and saying that they were scared about what was coming, but wanted to be prepared and prepare their flock. And I thought, wow, whatever is that holy crap revelation that's coming down the pipeline, somebody felt it was important to go to a bunch of pastors and give them a heads up. So This first dump of documents, not that exciting. Like you said, we've seen and heard a lot about it, but what's to come, I can't wait.
We'll see. And of course, people are talking about the fact that these will be coming out regularly. Listen, to my friends who don't know a lot about this, I wouldn't want to put down what has happened. It may not be full of the greatest content that you've ever seen on this topic, but at least there's a process underway that hasn't quite ever been in existence like this. So that's somewhat hopeful, and I do enjoy that. But my emotional reaction to it with this 30 years that I have and you have on this topic is, really? I mean, okay, I'm 100% sure that the U.S. government and probably governments around the world have HD quality video and HD quality photos, and they have all the supporting data that supports those videos as being real, and that some of those things would be just shocking as hell to see, for example, an anomalous craft in HD quality that clearly doesn't look like anything that you've ever seen before and is just feet away from an F-18 aircraft or something.
Don't you feel, though, that this is just more slow drip, right? We've been in this slow drip mode for decades now. And now that we're actually into disclosure, it's just more slow drip. When we talked about this episode, we said, let's zig where everyone else is zagging.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that going back to that quote about there's holy crap stuff coming, what I believe is coming is going to be the more unsettling aspects of disclosure. And I think we're going to go deep into the phenomenon. So I think this episode for us is a chance to look ahead to some of the things that we think may be coming down the pipeline.
I just want to reiterate what you just said or underline it, because the truth of the matter is there are hundreds of UFO podcasts out there, and they're all over this topic. And the one thing that has differentiated Sound, Light, and Frequency is that we have a different lens that we look at this thing through, which has been film and TV. So when you say zig when everyone else is zagging, I'm all in favor of that. But, and this is where we land today for this episode, Brent, there are some cases where the deeper you go into the literature, the more the cases and the personal testimony pile up. And you and I have had some cases like this, that the more the phenomenon refuses to stay in the box. And that's where the woo factor begins. Okay, well, first we got to define our terms. When we talk about woo in terms of ufology, that often refers to the strange, mystical, parapsychological, spiritual, occult, symbolic, and consciousness-based aspects of this UFO UAP mystery. And so it includes all kinds of things that aren't flying around in our skies looking like metal objects, such as telepathy and synchronicity and remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, apparitions, orbs, time slips, prophetic dreams, poltergeists, coincidences, cryptid encounters, hitchhiker effects. We could go on and on, but all the stuff that doesn't fit in that neat category. Yep. And what's so interesting about what we're going to talk about today is we've had some experiences. You've had a couple of barn burner experiences that we're going to get into. But there's also some movies that are all about woo.
Yeah, some of my favorite movies, actually. To jump on what you were just talking about, I have my own personal theory about the woo. And it goes like this. Most people look at three big categories. You've got aliens, UFOs, you've got the paranormal, and you've got the afterlife. And those are all three different areas of interest and research, and they're different genres in movies and in books. And my contention is, having experienced a little bit of all of that, is that it's all part of the same thing. And it's all, the continuity is both kind of consciousness, which is what we bring to the table, and the fact that, as our friend JC said, the universe runs on sound, light, and frequency. It's about energy. We are energy beings. I've experienced that firsthand. And we experience the world through our consciousness. And that means that I don't believe there are discrete lines between aliens, UFO, paranormal, and the afterlife. And so some of that is, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to explain. And I know that there's people in each camp that would prefer to be siloed, but I think we're talking about some version of quantum entanglement. Yeah. As you said, you read off all of these things that are part of the phenomenon, and people call it the woo factor, which is, oftentimes I've heard it used in a derogatory sense. Oh, well, that's just the woo factor, right? That's just weirdness and craziness, high strangeness, as if to dismiss it and say that's not real.
It is real. And I agree totally about how people have been concerned about it for many, many years. There was a sense, like even my old friend Stanton Friedman, right? Mm-hmm. He was all about the nuts and bolts because he felt that if he started talking about that kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about here, that people would tune him out. I remember talking to a fellow ufologist who believed strongly in these various paranormal woo things and said, yeah, but if I start talking about that, then I won't be taken credibly about this other stuff. So I guess what I'm saying and you're saying is, well, screw that. Yeah. Facts are facts. The fact is, there is something going on that isn't just nuts and bolts. Sometimes it is nuts and bolts, or it looks like it's nuts and bolts, and sometimes it's not. And then the other thing that is clear too, and this has been reported for a long time, why do UFOs or flying saucers in the 50s look one way? And now they look another way. Yes. And why did they look like airships in the 1890s? Mm-hmm. And why are people being abducted now, but hundreds of years ago, they were abducted by fairies? Were these people crazy, or were they describing the same thing, only with different words? Yeah.
And just to be clear, were they describing what they understood culturally at that time, what their filter of consciousness would allow them to believe, right? So if you were having an experience in 1840, you weren't thinking about spaceships. You weren't even thinking about airships. You were thinking about something that felt more supernatural, probably because that was what the cultural reference point was at the time. So again, I don't know that it is the full explanation, but I think it is definitely part of the equation.
I guess you could look at it this way. The costumes change, but the structure of the encounter remains similar.
Well said.
So for example, a lot of what happens in these kind of woo effect things are, there's a rupture in ordinary reality to see a craft in the air, but we see craft in the air. We see airplanes and now we see missiles and we see other things. So to see what is a UFO that's going faster than our stuff isn't rupturing reality. It's just like, oh, I wonder if they're from another planet. But there's a lot of other things that go with this distorted time, some kind of message that goes with it. Beings that appear human or almost human, all of that stuff, strange coincidences before or after the encounter. And I want to get to some of the film and TV versions of it because it's fascinating. But let's do a quick jump through time on this thing. And let's go all the way back to our man, H.P. Lovecraft, who when I first met you, you were talking about H.P. Lovecraft. And honestly, I didn't know that much about him. I know a lot more now because of our association, but I would be wrong to try to explain who he is when you're on the show. So please take it away.
So H.P. Lovecraft is one of my personal favorite authors. He wrote in 20s and 30s and maybe the 40s, but early 20th century. He wrote science fiction, but more from a science fiction horror, like a fantastic point of view. And his worldview was there are things around us at all times and we can't see them. And when we do see them, it will be so mind-blowing that we will probably go crazy. That was the through line of many of his stories, is people would see unspeakable, unnameable things in ancient entities that were all around us, and they would end up in a psychiatric hospital. And in fact, I adapted a H.P. Lovecraft story called The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which was one of the few novels he wrote. He wrote mostly short stories. It became a movie called The Resurrected that was directed by Dan O'Bannon, who was the writer of Alien and Total Recall. And I'm going to save it for another episode, but I spent a lot of time at Dan O'Bannon's house when we were working on that film. And going into his house was entering the phenomenon. So put a thumbtack in that. We'll come back to that later. But Lovecraft had a contemporary, actually someone that was writing fiction. So he was writing fiction. There was a nonfiction writer named Charles Fort, who was someone who collected strange stories from press around the world. And I believe his first book was called The Book of the Damned, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
What was it? The 1920s? 1919, yeah. And he literally was someone that just went across every publication through history and found anomalous stories and collected them into a huge volume that became the inspiration for several more well-known writers and investigators into the woo.
A couple of quick hits on both of those men. The Lovecraft thing always struck me as interesting because right now we are talking a lot about NHI, non-human intelligences, which is very Lovecraftian, right? Because he's basically in his writings, in his short stories primarily, saying that humanity exists alongside some vast non-human intelligences, correct? That we can't possibly understand. And you mentioned ancient entities, but there's this sense of forbidden knowledge and these cult transmissions and dreams and madness and hidden dimensions. And at the end of what makes Lovecraft so fascinating, I think, for people is the terror. And I use the word appropriately there.
Absolutely.
The terror of discovering that reality is much larger and less human-centered than we would have thought.
I think if I look back on Lovecraft, I did not have the word at the time, but I would have said what his characters largely experience is ontological shock.
Yes. Yeah. So Charles Fort goes at it in it. I think Lovecraft is going at it as a writer. He's thinking, well, what would be good to write about that will scare the pants off people, right? But Charles Fort was a little more ground-based, as you said. He's going through newspaper articles primarily and tales that people tell. And he just kept turning up things that you'd read it and you'd go, it was in the freaking newspaper.
Yes.
Right? It wasn't like he made it up like Lovecraft. He's talking about things that are falling from the sky that probably ought not to be falling from the sky. Objects that shouldn't exist. Mysterious lights, which we have plenty of right now. Disappearances, bizarre weather, but also anomalous creatures. Everything that comes to an event that doesn't fit a preconceived model, right? Which those are the guys that are the classics, if we will. But there are two people that have worked in our lifetime, and one of them is still alive, and that's Jacques Vallée, who is considered such a great UFO researcher, but his conclusions that he's made in a series of books all through his career do not fit nuts and bolts. The more Vallée went around the world and asked people to tell their stories, if I was to describe what Jacques Vallée has discovered for himself, his essential Vallée idea, if you will, is that UFOs may not represent a new phenomenon at all. We may think, oh, we're civilized and we have technology, and so people are coming to look at us from elsewhere. And he basically is saying the UFO UAP thing is, to use the costume metaphor, it's a new costume for an incredibly old one. And the phenomenon that we now like to use that word to talk about UFOs, UAP, but all this other stuff around it, he has always seemed to maintain that it is something that is interacting with our sense of myth or creating our myth.
Yes, right? Absolutely. There was two seminal books for me that outside of Lovecraft, which was fiction, one of them was Passport to Magonia. by
Yes.
Jacques Vallée, where he really dives into the folklore, the mythology, how this has all been tied to something much deeper into our culture and our psychology, getting into fairies and what we believed our interactions with them were. There's so much, as you said, structural similarity to those experiences that were reported centuries and centuries ago to the structural similarities of a modern day UFO abduction. And so I find that incredibly fascinating. And his contribution to this part of ufology is absolutely indelible. And because I believe he's someone that has a lot of respect, but I think a lot of people can't quite make sense of what his basic thesis is.
If you read his books over the years, he would basically be the guy to argue in a religious age, this non-human intelligence, this phenomenon, this whatever it is interpreted as angels and demons going back to biblical times. But that in a technological age, it appears as craft with pilots and laboratories and star maps. In essence, his conclusion is the content changes to match the era, but the pattern of destabilizing content and contact remains. So that's been his way to look at it. But now, if you go on X and start reading about Congress people like Luna and Boebert, Warren Boebert was just like, nope, it's angels and demons. Even as some of the people in Congress are taking sworn testimony about craft and occupants and bodies and reverse engineering, there's a countervailing thing going on at the same time that goes back to what Vallée was saying about angels and demons, which, listen, someday we will talk even more about Jacques Vallée. But now let's bring in the guy who I think is the closest analog to Charles Fort, which would be John Keel.
Yes. And since I was the one that brought him into our lives while we were early in the development process of Dark Skies, and I was a little bit intimidated by the sheer volume of UFO books you had. And I was furiously trying to catch up and read a bunch of the things you had on your bookshelf. And then I was so thrilled to find a book that you didn't have on your bookshelf called The Mothman Prophecies, that was a book by John Keel that was based on a true event. It's a nonfiction book, but when you read it, it's hard to imagine that this really happened. And yet, but you read enough of his books, he has a very kind of sober, investigative journalist approach to everything. And I remember reading that book, and I was both terrified and exhilarated. I just had a whole new point of view on what was going on, mostly because it opened a bunch of doors that I just had never really considered before. So we're going to talk about the book a little bit and the movie, because they've made a movie out of the Mothman Prophecies. And I think we both have opinions about the movie. But one thing about the book that I found absolutely fascinating is, just like Lovecraft, one of the things that Keel is positing is that there are NHI, and they take the form in ways that you can't imagine. It could be someone calling you on the phone that sounds like a human, but if you break it down, it's actually a computerized voice. Doesn't make any sense. The Mothman itself was a huge cryptoid that was, I think, 8 feet tall, a flying kind of moth man.
Bright red eyes.
Burning red eyes that looked and sounded like a demon. And this all was based around, I think, a little more than a year of high strangeness that took place in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. And John Keel, being a reporter, started to hear of strange things going on, and he started to investigate. What I loved about the book was the central idea that when you start investigating, when you put your intention and your attention onto the topic of the phenomenon, it pulls you in. And pretty soon you find yourself inside the phenomenon. And now, rather than just objectively observing events, the events start to happen to you. And you start to become part of that narrative. I think that's exactly what happened to John Keel in the course of that book.
But it happened to us.
And then it did happen to us.
I need to unpack that story, but I will say this. When you were admiring my book collection, I was a nuts and bolts guy at the time. Not completely, but certainly not to the level of the Mothman Prophecies. So when I read this thing, I was like, wow, where's the UFOs in this thing? And it involves the book, which was written in 1975. It's his first person account into this investigation of a wave of strange events that happened in 1966 and 1967, where people reported that large winged creature, the Mothman, and it ends up with a bridge collapse that ends the book. Anyway, this is a real story, folks. This really happened. Brent tells me I need to read the Mothman Prophecies. So I go buy a copy of the Mothman Prophecies, and I'm reading it. I may be, halfway through it. And so it's in my car. It's riding around in the backseat of my car because I'm reading it. And if I catch a few minutes here and there, I'm going to grab it out of the car. If I'm at the car wash, I'll read it, whatever. Okay. This is during dark skies. So this is 95, 96, somewhere in there where you tell me to read this thing. And I am reading it. And I take my oldest son, who was still a young kid at the time. I think he was about 10 years old. And I take him to the movies at our local movie theater. And so it was like a 7:30 movie or something. So it got out around 9:30, which, was allowed him to stay up a little later, allowed me to get to bed in time to get back to dark skies and work early in the morning. And so we're coming out after seeing this probably goofy kids movie, which I've seen thousands because of having 3 kids. And we're walking into a dark parking lot, and it's not particularly well lit. There are a couple of lights in it. I mean, it's not completely dark. There's some lights. And as we're walking out to our car, my son is by my side, and we see a guy at the end of the parking lot, and he's walking toward us. No big deal there. People look for their cars, although generally most people were walking out of the theater. This guy is from the other side walking toward the theater. So he's going to intersect with us. And as I get a look at him, he's wearing a long black duster jacket, almost like a Western duster thing.
Yeah, not good.
Not good. And I think he's got a hat on. So he doesn't quite look like a man in black. It's not a nice suit or something, but it's a duster jacket. It's down to past his knees. Yeah. And he looks formidable and a little scary. And because I thought, no, this isn't quite right, I take my son, who's he's on my right side, so he's going to intersect with this guy. And our car's on the other side. So I moved my son, Jonathan, over to this side, and I said to him, let's just go to our car. Don't make eye contact, right?
Okay.
This is just caution that you have in a big city.
Yeah, of course. You're a parent.
And you're
taking precautions.
Don't look at him, because then maybe he'll talk to us. And this guy does not look like someone we need to be talking to at this particular moment. So my son says, okay, and he's looking down, but we're walking to the car. And now this guy and me are intersecting. And as I look over at him, he really looks menacing in his own way. But this is the thing, and it's absolutely the truth. There's no embellishment here whatsoever. As the guy passes me, I realize he's holding a book. And the book is The Mothman Prophecies.
Now, let me just ask you one question. Before I had even brought this book to your attention, had you even heard of it before?
No.
Okay.
So I don't think. Maybe, but I don't think so.
Okay. So you probably never even heard of it. I give you the book, you start to read it, and now in the middle of a parking lot in Agoura Hills, you see a guy and he's carrying the exact book I asked you to read and that you have in your car. He didn't steal this copy out of your car. Correct. That's still okay.
Yeah. And let's face it, one of the things that has come up on this topic, Brent, which people debate all the time, which is, does investigating the phenomenon cause the phenomenon to see you and interact with you?
Yes.
And this is one of the things that the people who have investigated Skinwalker Ranch are always talking about, because there is a thing that Skinwalker has noticed, which is called the hitchhiker effect.
Yep.
So if orbs are following you at Skinwalker Ranch and you fly across the United States to your home, the orbs are still following you.
Yes.
And you go into your house and now the orbs are following your wife and kids.
Yes.
Right? That kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I think most people hear that and they think, oh, this is just the woo. This is high strangeness. This is the paranormal. I don't believe any of it. But I think if you step over onto the science side of the fence, I think you can explain that through quantum entanglement.
Yeah.
Right? We don't need to go deep on that, but I think that's partly the explanation. But going back to this book and the effect of this book, I had actually over the years recommended it to several other friends. And not everyone has had strange experiences, but you were not the only one that had a strange experience. Other people noticed strange things like that. And I did actually have one other friend where the exact same thing happened. They had never heard of the book. They went into a coffee shop. They started to read it. And across the way in the coffee shop was someone else reading the book.
I have never heard this story from you. Wow.
Yeah. So you could say, oh, that's just a coincidence. It's a popular book. It actually wasn't that popular when I found it. It was an obscure thing. It certainly had not been made into a movie yet.
Brent, the book was written in 1975. And when this is happening to us, it's 21 years later.
Yeah. Right.
So no, it wasn't a popular book at that time.
Right. Now let's talk about the movie.
Yes.
Because there was a movie that came out that was odd choice in casting, which was Richard Gere plays John Keel. And, when
a different name, John Klein in the movie.
Yes. When I heard they were making a movie out of it, how sometimes you have your favorite book and we're going to make a movie out of it. And you go, oh no, you're going to ruin it. Like, how would you make a movie out of this? But I was so excited that I thought, no, you know what? I'm going to be optimistic. And I think there's some great things in the movie, but there's a couple things that I felt the movie didn't do well or did not do the book justice. So before we get into my point of view, let me hear your point of view.
Well, listen, I think there are few cases where a book and its movie are so divergent. There are cases where books have been radically reinterpreted, but not as much as this one, because the thing is structurally, the book, The Mothman Prophecies by John Keel, is sort of about escalation. These sightings start as a local weirdness, then they become an epidemic of anomalous experience. People start gathering in locations to see them. And as Keel tells the thing, because he is a guy that in the same way we use movies as portals into larger discussions, that's what he does in his book. So he's covering this bridge disaster that happened on the Ohio River in 1967, but he's also covering the Mothman thing and all of that. And he's constantly using that to ask whether the phenomenon is physical or psychic or symbolic or deceptive or all of these things at the same time. Okay. So he's got a mind expanding book on his hands here. Part of the reason you recommended it is it'll blow your mind.
Yeah.
That's probably what you told me in words like it. Just read it. It'll expand your consciousness. So that's why I was reading it. Now, what's I found so bizarre about the film is there's no Mothman in it.
Yeah. It's a weird point of view, right? Where they go to kind of the point of view of something flying. And what I found too is that they didn't capture the high strangeness as much. They kept it more around the Mothman or the idea of a Mothman. But in the book, they had men in black in it. They had strange ambulances. They had strange voices. They had much more kind of hauntings and things that were paranormal. And it brought up this idea, which, as you referenced, Skinwalker Ranch, is this was all happening in a little town in Virginia, Point Pleasant. Or was West Virginia, right?
West Virginia. Yeah.
Right. And so this idea of convergence is super important, where everything becomes localized and there's no explanation for it. Well, why was it all happening there in this little town? They never explain it. Why is it all happening on Skinwalker Ranch? There's some Indian lore around the place, but there's no scientific explanation for why it's a convergent point of high strangeness. So amidst all of this high strangeness, one of the things that I found so fascinating about the book was it all happened simply because there was an investigative journalist who was curious and wanted to know more. In the movie, they bring in a whole subplot about the lead character's dead wife. And I know why they did it. We both know why. Like, that makes it more compelling. You can relate to this character, and feels like he's getting messages from his dead wife. And it's all about, ultimately, it's a story about him letting go, to some degree, of him being haunted by his dead wife. Where I felt that diminished the movie, and to a degree, the book, the source material, is that in the book, it wasn't about that. It was simply about putting focus and attention on this strangeness and becoming immersed in it. And there was a key point for me where the movie lost me. And that was at about the 85 minute mark. So we're towards the end of the movie. The character gets rid of all of his notes and everything. He gets it out of his life, right? Yeah. But all of the strangeness continues because why? He hasn't let go of his wife yet. In the book, the whole point of the book was The only way for John Keel to put all of this strangeness behind him was to get rid of all of the work, over a year's worth of work and reportings and recordings, and burn it and get rid of it and throw it away. And once he did that, his life slowly returned to normal. And to me, that's a perfect microcosm of how the phenomenon works. You have to literally close that door physically and mentally to have any hope of escaping it.
I find that story riveting, though, about burning your work, because you and I have already had this conversation on the show where part of the reason we have the detailed Dark Skies timeline that we have is because I'm a collector of the shit that comes from doing a TV series. I've got most of it. And you were a giver away of stuff. So you
Yes.
had less of it. And I will say there have been a couple of times in my career since the Dark Skies days where I have been tempted to just say, you know what? I don't know if paying attention to this UFO issue is attracting weird stuff to my life, but just in case, what if I get rid of everything? Just like he did. And I've never brought myself to do it. So I guess I'm still stuck with it. The writer of the movie read the Mothman Prophecies 20 times, which is about 18 times more than I've read it. So you can't say that he threw the book out.
No.
He was obsessed with the book and trying to find the essence of the book. But there aren't people going out to watch the Mothman in the movie, to the best of my knowledge. I don't recall that they're doing that, right? But what does happen, I think his car breaks down and he goes to this guy's house, a guy named Gordon Smallwood, who reacts as if he has already been to his house previous nights.
Yes.
Now that's weird and strange. And I thought that was kind of an intriguing thing. They don't really pay it off ever, though. I mean, it's just like a lot of anomalous behavior. It's like, well, that was weird. I wonder what the explanation is. Right. And there are things like this Gordon Smallwood, who says you were here the last few days, claims that he's been hearing voices from a being named Indrid Cold.
Love that name.
Indrid Cold. And and so now our main character, John Klein, a.k.a. John Keel, starts receiving these phone calls from Cold, who knows all these facts about his private life that he wouldn't ordinarily have. And there's things in it that are just strange. Like he hears the phrase, "Wake up, number 37.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yep.
So I'm not going to spoil the ending because I think some people may want to see that.
Yeah.
But what they've done in the film is turned the bridge disaster into the big Act 3 thing.
I do think you should watch the movie, but what I would do is watch the movie, then read the book, and the book will resonate in a different way. You won't feel like, so that would be the order of preference.
I think you're right. Then it means that people could accept the film for what it is rather than every time I've seen the film, I go, that's what? What are you doing? And I have to say, it's not a terrible film.
No, it's just compared to what my expectations for it were. That's where I think the delta is.
Now, we've been going on, and honestly, we must get to a couple of your stories here because they're the ones that I think, look, woo is one thing when it's happening to somebody else, right? But when I saw that guy with the book, that was happening to me.
Yes.
Right? It didn't freak my son out because he didn't read the book. He didn't know what it meant.
He didn't have any context for it. Yeah.
Right. But it freaked me out. And I remember telling you the next day and you were freaked out. We're like, how could that be happening? So fire away when ready, my friend.
Yes. Let me segue into the first set of stories that I'm going to tell by putting a bow on the Mothman Prophecies. One of the big takeaways for me was not just the high strangeness, but also the nature of the NHI, which is that they were tricksters. They often seem to enjoy sending you down a dead end or into a dark alley or sending you off on a wild goose chase and then mocking you. And so that I think is fascinating because it raises the question, if these are aliens, why are they just here to be amused by humans, right? If they're angels, then well, they're being kind of mean, but it's hard to even call it demonic. It's more just that they're tricksters. And that is, something that Jacques Vallée touches on extensively in his writings about going back into the lore of the tricksters and the fairies, right? At any rate, let me get into something that kind of sets the table for a few things that I'm going to share. The first is that, as I mentioned early on in one of our episodes, I have been an experiencer since pretty much the age of 5. And starting at age 5 up until I was around 40, amongst many other things, there has been a continuing line that has happened to me that is beyond explanation. And that is, I have seen 6 people die in horrible ways. We're talking Final Destination ways. And they were all strangers. And they all happened right near me. And Jeez. I've never worked in a hospital. I was not in the military. I was not a paramedic. I had no reason to be in a place where I would experience 6 different horrific deaths. But I was. And so then you have to ask, well, why? Why would that happen? I don't know if I have the answer. I have a theory.
I'm assuming you have dwelt on this quite a while.
Yes, this is something I come back to over and over again. I'm not going to go into
why though, Brent. Give us. I'd love a little meat on those bones. What are these? In short, what are these 6?
I'm going to touch on a couple of them.
Okay.
The first one happened when I was 5 years old with my father. We were driving in the Bay Area, coming down a very steep hill called Marin Boulevard. And we saw there was a woman on a motorcycle in front of us. And we saw her get into an accident and she was beheaded. And my dad slammed on the brakes and I literally saw her head roll out into the street. I'm 5 years old. Being 5 years old, my first thought was, how are they going to put it back on? It struck me as very surreal. And I remember my dad turned my head and said, don't look. And he jumped out of the car and went over to try and help. And of course my head was on a swivel and that's all I did was look and just take it all in. So in that one, it's hard to process. What do you make of that? Skip ahead a few years. Now I'm a teenager. I'm walking down Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, right on the Cal campus or adjacent to it. And I'm with a girl on my first date with her. And it's a Sunday evening. And we are going there, I'm not proud to say, because we were 17 years old. And there was a pizza place that would serve you beer if you looked close to 21, right? So this was our destination.
That was your plan.
That was my plan. Yeah. And as we're walking, we're talking and everything's great. And our hands kind of brush. And suddenly I'm holding this girl's hand, first date. And everything is right in the world until there's a whoosh, there's motion in front of me. I can't even process it. It happens so fast. And the most horrific noise I've ever heard in my life. And while I'm trying to make sense of it, my arm is yanked backwards and the girl is holding onto my hand as she's running away. And I let go of her and I watch her just sprinting the opposite direction. And as I turn back to look, there's a man laying on the sidewalk and he is half naked. His head has been completely crushed because, as I will find out very soon, he just jumped from a 3rd-story window and landed a foot in front of us. Now, what made the whole thing surreal was that this was about 7 o'clock. There had been a big kind of street bazaar there and everyone had cleared out and there was really nobody on the streets. And so I'm standing there by myself looking at this flailing horrific body and I don't know what to do. So I walk into the building that I look up and I see the window open and the curtains blowing and I put 2 and 2 together and I realize this person just jumped and almost landed on us. I go into that building and it's a hotel and there's a person on the phone. He sees me come over and he's in the middle of a conversation. He goes, yes, can I help you? And I said, somebody just jumped from a 3rd-story window. And he's like, well, what did they look like? And I said, well, their head is not, I can't tell you. And he goes, well, did they have a beard? I said, I think so. He puts the phone back and he says, you know what? Carl jumped again. I can't believe it. Why would this, you know what? Hey, listen, thank you very much. I'll call it in. And he went back to his conversation and I didn't know what to do. So I walked back out and I just stood there waiting for cops and an ambulance to come. Eventually they did. They asked me some questions. No one seemed that concerned about it. And years later, as I would go on to, Telegraph Avenue, I remember watching the blood stain just get smaller and smaller and smaller until it wasn't there anymore. And when I think about that story, it reminds me that you can be in a situation where something happens and for you, it will haunt you to the rest of your life. And for everybody else, no one cared. It was insignificant. It was just another person that lost it on Telegraph Avenue, right? Another student who couldn't handle things and jumped out a window. To me, I will never get the sound of his head hitting the asphalt out of my memory. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little further because The next one was the last one. And this is why I think there was meaning in all of the things that I saw, because I'm going to give you a little kind of preview of what my theory is. We talked about in episode 4, my encounter with death, right? Where I was in a hospital, I was dying of cancer, I had sepsis, temperature of 105.5, and I had light beings come to the foot of my bed. And I wasn't scared. In fact, throughout most of my whole cancer experience, I wasn't scared. You talked to me a number of times.
Right.
I was just kind of accepting of the whole thing. Why? Because I'd faced death. I'd seen it a number of times, not through a loved one, right? Not through a controlled situation, but in the worst possible way. You could say, well, I'd become desensitized to it. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is it was preparing me for my own moment where I had to face death, right? And I faced it with as much strength as I could at the time. This last example, or this last story, the sixth person, happened when we were at Dark Skies. We were writing something late at night one Friday, I think probably for a Monday shoot. I was there with my assistant, Adam, and there was a huge explosion that happened outside, and the power flickered for a moment, and we went outside, and there was a car across the street that had flipped and gone into kind of like an auto construction yard, and the car alarm was going off, but it was behind a fence with barbed wire on it, and it was like, okay, we can't help that car. The other car was down the road, and this is in North Hollywood, so it was not a residential area. It was very industrial. And it had veered off the road into a parking lot and kind of like stopped right in front of a building. And as I started to approach it, I said to Adam, go call 911. I start heading down to the car. The driver's door opens and a teenager runs out and runs away, like hit and run or whatever this was. And I thought, oh boy, okay, this is not good. But just to make sure everyone else was okay, I go all the way to the car. I go to the passenger side, and there is a man, a Hispanic man, slumped without a seatbelt on in the front seat. And he kind of raises his head as I come to the window, and he looks at me, and he's got blood coming out of his ear, which is never a good sign. And he does not look well. And so I reach over to the door. I open it up. It's unlocked. And I kneel down, and I said, I'm trying to talk to him. And he's looking at me, but he's not super responsive. And I'm saying, I called 911. It's going to be okay. I'm trying to reassure him. And he reaches out this trembling hand to me. And so I take his hand and he squeezes it, and he's just looking at me right in the eyes. And all of the sudden, I feel this electric shock coming through me. Like his energy is moving through me as I'm watching it leave his body. And as it's moving through me, I am seeing images from his life in wherever, Mexico or whatever. And I'm hearing Spanish. I'm like, and it all happens in like 4 or 5 seconds. It's like that moment when people say your life flashes before you. His life flashed before me. And next thing I know, he's gone. He's dead. He's holding my hand. His hand goes slack. He's a husk. There's nothing. He's gone. And in that moment, I hear from the back seat, Papa.
Oh.
And a little 5-year-old kid without a seatbelt pops back up as if he knew right at that moment. Nothing was said between me and this man. And somehow this kid knew that his father had just died. At any rate, I say all of this because there are certain aspects of that story that are going to inform the next story I'm going to tell you.
I actually want to just vouch for that story. I don't know the part about the being at the car and all that, but there were a number of us who were outside. We were in this warehouse.
Yes.
And a number of us were outside as the ambulances and the police cars and everything came, and we were all watching it. And wow, that's pretty crazy.
It is. And I think, again, I feel in a weird way, I used to think there was a time when seeing these deaths was a curse, right? And I actually feel in a weird way that it was a blessing, that it, again, prepared me for my own moment years later.
It's like instead of you having a near-death experience, you experienced his death, which is
exactly.
If I've had a near-death experience, but the thing about it is it could be explained. You can explain a near-death experience. You've got endorphins running through you or whatever, but this one, not really. Not really.
As we move into the next story, I think one of the things to take away from this is that this notion of what we touched upon earlier and is part of kind of the woo is that we are energy beings, right? And what are NHI? People talk about orbs, whether it's someone like Chris Bledsoe, who's had his own strange, very metaphysical, spiritually tinged experience. When you go talk about orbs, people are oftentimes want to say, oh, those are entities. Those are, plasma beings or whatever it is. But I think we've also heard stories of Foo Fighters that were in World War II, these orbs or entities that were attached to kind of planes up in the air. There have been reports that that's how crop circles are made, that these orbs or these energy beings come in and actually inscribe them in the wheat. So I don't know what any of that means, other than it's clear there's something else going on here, as you said, beyond the nuts and bolts. I think the tendency is to, if it isn't nuts and bolts, it's angels and demons, right? And it's one of the two. Like you gotta choose. And I think there's something else. I think there's this third rail where it's just not explainable. And so this next story I want to tell you is one in which, going back to the hitchhiker effect, in Skinwalker Ranch, a lot of it was the investigators themselves. They would go in and they would spend time at the ranch. And then, as you said, they'd go home across the country sometimes, and the phenomenon would follow them.
And just to give our sound, light, and frequency connections, Secrets of Skinwalker Ranch is a big show on, I believe, History Channel. And it's because Brandon Fugel, bought the place from Robert Bigelow.
Robert Bigelow, yes.
Robert Bigelow. And they're attempting to quantify woo. They're bringing all the technology that they can bring to bear. Some episodes are disturbingly authentic, and some of them are time fillers.
Yes.
Because you can't do that many episodes and find out the secret of the universe in every episode.
You can't always predict when strangeness is going to happen.
Correct.
Right?
So anyway, onward.
Yes. So that hitchhiker effect, though, as I think is demonstrated so nicely in the Mothman Prophecies, it doesn't have to just be about you're in one location and you move to another location. It can also just be about what you study. It can be about what you put your attention on. And this is a story that happened to me when I was in my late 20s. I was living in LA. I was a budding screenwriter. I'd already sold my Lovecraft story, The Resurrected, and I was working on a ghost story that happened to be a comedy. And I was really having trouble with the scene where the main character met his deceased wife. And I wanted it to be funny, right? But at the same time, I wanted it to feel real. And I kept thinking to myself, okay, in order to make it funny, I have to know what would really happen so I can put a comedic twist on it. I need the baseline. So I started reading some ghost stories. And, it was like everything was boring and nothing really inspired me. And I couldn't make this scene work. And so my whole script was stalled. I'm sure you've been there.
Oh, yeah.
So I kind of put it on the back burner. And at the time, I had this very nifty ritual where I would write until probably 3 or 4 in the morning, because at that time, and this was probably the mid to, it was the late 80s, I had money, so I didn't have to get up at any specific time. I just worked at home. But there was something cool about writing from around midnight until 3 or 4 in the morning, because everyone else was asleep. There were no interruptions. And then I would sleep in until 10, 11, sometimes even 12. And I had a whole morning ritual where every morning I'd get up and I'd walk out and I'd get the LA Times. And before I even had breakfast or anything to eat, I'd come back and I'd sit on my bed and I'd start reading the LA Times. And I'd often do it with my cat, who I had at the time. This one morning, I am sitting there reading the LA Times. It's probably noon. I mean, it's broad daylight, and I'm in a little bungalow apartment off Melrose Avenue in the middle of LA. I'm reading the paper, and my mind drifts back to this script that I'm writing. And I'm thinking, is today the day? Am I going to try and do it? And meanwhile, I'm just kind of like browsing the headlines in the paper. And all of a sudden, I hear a voice say to me, I'm right here.
I'm right here.
I'm right here. And I was kind of taken aback because there was no one else in my apartment with me and there was no one else in the room. But the voice was very clear. It came in one ear, and it wasn't a male or female. It was, I always say it was like pure information. It was just, I just knew that I'm right here. And then I sensed something like almost like a weird chill in the room. And I lowered the paper, and at the foot of my bed, there's a woman standing there. And this woman is completely three-dimensional, but translucent. I can see through her. And she's got long, stringy blonde hair, and she's in kind of a tattered, like sundress type thing. And she's a little frumpy looking, and she's just standing there. and I'm looking at her. And what immediately jumped out at me were her eyes. Her eyes looked as though if you gave like a 3-year-old a piece of charcoal and you said, draw a circle, they would do this really rough thing. Her eyes were these rough black holes that were undulating. And that was very unsettling. And as I'm focusing on this, there is a rush of movement, just like when the man jumped in front of me. The paper fell out of my hand. My cat jumped off the bed with such force that it left huge divots from its claws on my leg. I felt my whole body being slammed back against the headboard, and I felt tremendous pressure on my biceps. And as I'm trying to orient myself, I start to feel a tickle on my neck. And I'm having one of those rack focus moments where I'm like, wait, what is happening? What's going on? And I look up and this woman has jumped on me. She's pounced onto me. Her knees are on my biceps and she's holding my arms down and her head is right over mine. And Bryce, I looked up into those swirling black holes and I saw the cosmos. I saw stars, a star field that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. And I felt myself lifting up out of my body. Now, I've had out-of-body experiences before. This one was completely different because this one felt as though I was being sucked, right? It wasn't just me kind of floating. It was me being sucked like in a vacuum. And I felt myself being pulled up into the cosmos through those eyes. And then I heard the voice again. And the voice said to me, just look away.
Just look away.
And it was so insistent, that voice, that I took it as like a supreme command. Like everything depended on me being able to look away. And I, with all of the energy I had, I turned my head and it was gone. The spell was broken. There was no one there. But I was surging. And in that moment, I looked around, and this was a 1940s kind of LA bungalow. So it had all of that stucco, you know, on the roof and on the walls. And it was like looking at the Grand Canyon. Anything I put my attention on, I was like zooming in on it. And I could see the dust particles that were as big as sagebrush. It was absolutely amazing. And all of a sudden, almost involuntarily, I yelled, "Come back." Because in that moment, I had never felt more alive. I felt as if I took my fingers and I put them into an electrical outlet. I was so charged up and I wasn't scared. Even though there was a component of the whole thing that felt strange, I was not scared. After this happens, I do what any responsible person would do. I call every person I know and I say, "Oh, you won't believe what happened." And everyone says pretty much to a friend, "Oh, you just fell back asleep." No, I did not fall back asleep. I slept until noon. I was wide awake. I was halfway through reading the LA Times and this thing happened. They said, "Oh, you just imagined it. You were working on a ghost story. It's all your imagination." And enough people told me that where I started to believe it. And after a couple weeks, the whole thing went away and I was back to writing on my story. And that was that until one day a friend called me up and he said, "Hey, remember that story you told me about that woman at the foot of your bed?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I want you to walk down the street, Melrose Avenue, to a place called Soap Plant." I don't know if you remember this store. Soap Plant was this esoteric kind of stuff where they had candles, very new agey, but they also had a whole book section.
Probably where I bought Mothman.
So I walk down there and the instructions he gives me is, "I want you to pick up the new Whole Earth catalog." Now, the Whole Earth catalog, for those people who aren't familiar, was basically, it was before the internet. So it was somebody had collected all of these strange and out of print books, and you could buy them on the Whole Earth catalog. And sometimes they were one of a kind. Sometimes they were just hard to find. But someone had come up with in all these different categories. And he says, go to the Whole Earth catalog and go to page 187. I get to the Whole Earth catalog. I'm in this store. There's people all around me. I start flipping through. I find page 187. I start looking at the titles. I'm like, okay, what's this? And all of a sudden I see this one book, and it was like something called Witch Rider. And it's stories from Eastern Europe or Scandinavia or something that were about the legend of a woman who was sometimes called the Witch Rider, sometimes called the Old Hag, who the legend says would appear at the foot of your bed and she would jump on you and steal your soul if you let her. And the legend said if you didn't battle her and overcome her, people would find you in bed the next day deceased. And as I'm reading this, all of the fear that I did not have during that event came up through me at that moment. And I remember throwing the book out of my hand. I wanted nothing to do with that book or that story or anything, because I could not reconcile how some spirit from centuries ago in Eastern Europe or Scandinavia or whatever it is could appear at the foot of my bed in Melrose Avenue on a Thursday at noon. It did not make any sense. The world felt very small and very scary at that moment. So I live with this story for years, and I have told people about this story, and people have then called me up the next day and said, I hate you for telling me that story. I saw something at the foot of my bed. I freaked out. Now I can't sleep in that room anymore. Like, there's a transference quality to it, which is similar to the hitchhiker effect. Now, as we come to the end of the episode, I just want to share something.
Before you do on the old hag, you told me that story. And then a few years later, I was the showrunner of a show called The Crow Stairway to Heaven.
Yes, yeah.
The TV version. You even wrote an episode of it.
Yep.
So I was running this show. And so the Crow basically is a guy that dies and he comes back reincarnated a year later. Anyway, so I was studying up on afterlife phenomenon. And I had, in the same way that you've described, I had a bunch of UFO books. For this show, I had a bunch of books about the afterlife and all that. So when you told me that story, I sort of put it in my head, didn't think too much about it. And as I was reading those books while doing The Crow, there is a description in one of my books about the old hag or whatever. Same description, black coal is how I believe they described him, jumping on people in bed. So clearly, I'm here to vouch for the fact that, A, you told me that story, and then I saw that. And frankly, I was thinking about that very story just a couple of days ago, because while I was off visiting my daughter in Boston, we were just looking for something to watch on TV. And there's a new series out called Widow's Bay with Matthew Rhys, I believe his name is. And it's got an old hag that jumps him in bed one night. She didn't have the coal eyes, but she's pretty frightening, and she did pin him down. There is that storyline that's out there. So yeah, you consider yourself a member in a long fraternity of people that have been jumped in bed by old hags with coal eyes.
Well, and one of the scientific theories is that it's a form of sleep paralysis, right? Somehow it's a archetypal nightmare that people have. They keep seeing this same woman. Now, even that is strange. What is the chance that people across centuries would be seeing the exact same entity at the foot of their bed? But be that as it may, I'm not saying that it's real. I'm just saying it happened to me. Here's the last thing I want to leave you with, that I think that's a dark story, but there's actually a silver lining to it. There was a component of it that always disturbed me, that feels like it's quintessential woo. The voice said to me, I'm right here. In my mind, I always associated that with the entity. Hey, you've been looking for a real ghost story. Well, I'm right here. You're about to have one, right? But it didn't reconcile with the fact that same voice said to me, just look away. That's cross purposes, because on one hand, I'm right here says, I'm about to jump on you. The other one says, you know what? I don't really want to steal your soul. Just look away and you can opt out of this. But I never could make sense of it. I just always took it at face value and said, the whole thing is just weird. There's no logic to it. Until about a year ago, I was talking to a friend who happens to be a medium. And as I start to tell her the story and I say, I'm right here, she goes, oh, that was your higher self. That was your guardian angel, as it were. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, oh, well, when you were about to experience something traumatic like that, if you're in contact with your higher self, they were just letting you know that you're not going to be experiencing it alone. She said the entity would not give you that warning. The entity was there to steal your soul. And what the voice was saying is, don't worry, I'm right here by your side. And that was the voice that said, just look away. That was the voice that saved you. So when we come back to this framing of it's either angels or demons or it's aliens, right? There's this other lane where my higher self, or maybe tied to my consciousness or something else that is not angels or demons, that is not aliens, somehow let my soul stay in my body and not disappear into the cosmos. And that is very comforting to me, that some aspect of me is watching out for me.
I love that aspect of it. These are wild stories and disturbing in their own way. I have one final story I'm going to throw as a log on this fire.
Yes, please.
Because it's not as dramatic as being jumped in your bed by an old hag who's trying to steal your soul or whatever. And yet it's oddly disturbing, and it sort of fits in with what we've been talking about, where we talked about like the postcards that came to us before while we were writing Dark Skies. Okay, this is after Dark Skies. It's after The Crow. It's after all that. It's 2010, and I'm writing this book, AD After Disclosure, with Richard Dolan, who many people know. I'm currently hosting Need to Know with Dolan, and we wrote that book together. And it took about a year. And for off and on during the year, we would have phone calls where, because he lived on the East Coast, I lived on the West Coast, and we'd say, hey, I was just thinking, what about this? What about that? And so we each had our own sort of research that we were doing, and then we would compare notes. And I had a file, just so you know, I had my own file. There was nothing like Google Docs right now where, you and I share files, and I can write on top of you and you can leave comments. We didn't have any of that. We basically wrote, I believe back then I was on Mac, so I was using Pages, I think, but I had my own little Pages file, and occasionally I would turn it into a PDF and send it off to Rich for him to look at. But this one particular day, there's no file open on my computer, and we're just having a shoot the breeze conversation. And one of us, I think it was me, had mentioned something about threes. So we were just saying, well, is there anything to threes? Do these beings have three fingers? What about these triangular craft with three lights? What's the deal with threes? And we had, maybe it was kind of an uneventful conversation because did it really belong in an after disclosure book? Not really sure, but it was just a divergence. We're talking about it. Okay. So that happens. The next day I decide, okay, well, it's time to get back to work. So I open up my Pages file, which has all my research notes in it. I'm thinking, I had taken handwritten notes from the day before, and I'm thinking, okay, I got to write up these research notes. So I open up the file. There on page 1 are my previous research notes. But in the middle of the page are 3 lines of threes.
The number 3.
The number 3. And it's just, if you hold the number 3 down on your keyboard, it's almost like it's just printing threes. So there's 3 entire lines of threes. I didn't put them there. Rich didn't put them there. We didn't share the file. Nobody snuck into my house to put them there, but there they were. So I've over the years said, well, what would explain that? I guess one would be, it could be the phenomenon, expressing itself. I guess a more down to earth one would be, I was being watched because of our Dark Skies thing. Yeah. And somebody who's part of whatever the cover up is or whatever is messing with me. It's the equivalent of the postcard that said, we are watching you. This one is a different way to say it, but I definitely felt like somebody's watching me or something because there it was. I can't explain it other than those 2 options, but those things happen to people. These synchronicities, but this is more than a synchronicity. It's not just a coincidence. I guess you could almost argue it's a coincidence that the Mothman Prophecy book is in the hands of the dark stranger, if you will. But I'm not sure what explains this one. And so I guess as we have to wrap this, it appears that the central question for Woo at this point, because it's starting to be studied with people with technology and data and all that, as we discussed with Skinwalker, maybe someday somebody will have some better answers for some of these kinds of things. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is to the old hag. Let's say on the one where you've seen 6 people expire in front of you, I'm not sure if there is a phenomenon that is a non-human intelligence, why it chooses to do this to Brent Friedman.
I asked myself that question many times. Look, I think if I had to try and summarize all of this, it's a version of the quote we used in The Abyss. When you stare at the abyss, stares back at you.
Yes.
And I think in this case, you can say, and it taunts you, it teases you, it misdirects you. And it's that sense of seeing the number 3 after you've been talking about it. There's that trickster mentality again, right? It's not threatening, but it's unsettling. And I think why the old hag? Why have I seen these 6 deaths? Why have I had a lot of strange experiences in my life? I think it's all sending me a message. I think that for whatever reason, I have shown curiosity, and at times I have investigated this area, and it's acknowledging me.
Yeah, I see. That is exactly what people speculate about. Listen, we've already done this incredibly long show. One of the best TV series about woo is Twin Peaks.
Yes.
It's not really about UFOs, although in the final season, there are some UFOs and Project Blue Book invoked, but it's a great woo TV series if you're looking for that. And look, we don't have time to get into these. We're going to talk maybe at another episode later in the season, or God forbid, maybe we'll come back in a second season and do it. But just a couple of things that people might want to consider. The John Travolta film Phenomenon is about a download, and people are talking about downloads, that you're just cruising along in your life and you wake up the next day and you understand physics, right? And those things happen. So there's a movie about that. I believe you're a Picnic at Hanging Rock fan.
Huge fan of Picnic at Hanging Rock, with the caveat that if you don't like slow foreign films, you won't like this. But it's a Peter Weir film. The guy did Gallipoli, Master and Commander, The Truman Show. Excellent filmmaker. Based on a true story that happened in Australia. Highly recommend it. Super woo.
A fairly current film is Annihilation, which is sort of about some kind of alien presence that doesn't communicate in a normal way, but does it by transforming and duplicating and mutating and all that stuff. Another good one, of course, is Solaris, where the planet itself, or the ocean in the planet, seems to be alive and interacting with human consciousness. There's two versions of it, the original Russian version and then,
the George
Clooney version. Yeah. And a couple that I've seen recently, one is Coherence, which it's a small budget film. It fits very much within the film that the series we talked about earlier, Dark. It's kind of like, what's going on here? Are the timelines shifting? Who's doing what? Yeah. And I just saw another one on the plane the other day, The Nines, which stars Ryan Reynolds. But it's fascinating, and it's definite woo going on. But my favorite that I've always loved, and I wonder if you've seen it, is the Casey Affleck, Rooney Mara movie, A Ghost Story.
Yes, that is excellent.
I find that interesting because it challenges the essence of a ghost story. It inverts time and what looks like initially a person who's died who can't move on or whatever. And by the end of the thing, it's cosmic. It's just a cosmic story and kind of chilling. But again, if you want to go evil woo, you got to go Twin Peaks.
Yes. One of my favorite lines from Twin Peaks was, "The owls are not what they seem."
Yes. They never are. And in fact, that goes back to, I believe, Whitley Strieber was talking about owls in Communion. Anyway, I guess the essence of this is, yes, there is certainly a lot of files out there. There are videos, there are photos. There's all this stuff that's likely to be coming out. And maybe we are going to finally at least acknowledge there's an intelligence out there that's different than ours, that seems to be here and interacting with us. And if we do anything with this episode, it is simply to suggest that interacting with us doesn't just mean flying around in spaceships and picking up people to do biological experiments on them, which apparently has happened, or at least is meant to look like it's happened by something. Yes. But there's also this world that you've peeled back for us with your stories and with these other stories, and they're disturbing, and yet they happen. In fact, I would probably argue more people experience the woo factor than they do the UFO factor.
Absolutely. Anyway, and maybe we'll have to do a whole nother episode, a part 2 about the woo, because there are many other stories to tell, many other interesting movies and TV shows to talk about, but this has been a lot of fun.
Soundlight and Frequency is an iHeart podcast produced by Stellar Productions. It's executive produced by Nick Johnson, and for Stellar, Jackie Zabel. Our show's music was written by Anna Stumpf and Hamilton Lighthouser. And your hosts and executive producers are Bryce Zabel, that's me, and Brent Friedman. Watch the skies.